Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this digital conference on future-proofing the Nordics and resilient leadership in doing so. We're coming to you live from Nordregio's offices in the center of beautiful Stockholm, and we're very happy to have you all with us this morning. We'll be with you for the next 2.5 hours, more or less, and we do have an exciting program waiting for you. Throughout this conference, you will be able to ask questions to the speakers in this studio, and you simply use the chat at the bottom of your screen, I believe it is, and you can send your questions in. I will make sure to ask them to the people here in the studio. Before we get going, I'm joined by you, Anna Lundgren. You are Senior Research Fellow here at Nordregio, and you also head the Secretariat to a Nordic group for collaboration on green innovative, that was a difficult word from the morning, and resilient regions. So would you begin by telling us a bit about why we're here today?
Yes, thank you so much, Tina, and very welcome to this webinar. It's actually a wrap-up of a work that we have been conducting the past 4 years now. It's within the framework of the Nordic Regional Collaboration Program, where we have had a group focusing on green, innovative and resilient region, and we've been a bunch of researchers from Nordregio, but also stakeholders from regions, from cross-border regions and from the national governments in the Nordic countries that have worked together. So this is both a wrap-up and sharing some results, and it's also the kickoff for the next period.
Yeah, and tell us a bit about, this is what you call the TGC, right?
Right.
So I was wondering a bit about the abbreviation. I haven't quite figured it out yet, but it is called the TGC.
It's called the TGC in our Nordic lingo, and fully understandable. It's not so easy to figure out. There's also been a group working on urban issues and a group working on rural issues, and we have been the group working primarily on regional issues.
So tell us a bit about the work you have done in this TGC, the way you have collaborated.
So as I mentioned, it's been a team of researchers from Nordregio that have worked together with these stakeholders and with the guidance from the Nordic Council of Ministers and the overarching vision of the Nordic Council of Ministers to become the most sustainable and integrated region in the world, and both economically and socially and environmentally focusing on. We have picked up a couple of themes that we have worked on during this 4-year period within this overarching heading of green, innovative and resilient regions. And some of these topics we will hear more about today.
So it's been a collaboration between both researchers and people that are more hands-on in their everyday work.
Absolutely, yes.
And how has this taken place? Have you been discussing as you went along?
So we've had a process during these 4 years where we met both physically and digitally with this larger group, and where the stakeholders have contributed with their knowledge and input, with suggestions for case studies, for example, but also with critical remarks on the research that we have been doing. So the input from the stakeholders has been very important for this work.
And how do you hope this work will then live on, so to speak? What do you see happening after doing all this research?
Well, what we hope for is to make this research useful, so that we can, through this collaboration, that we both increase knowledge, the collected knowledge among researchers and stakeholders, but also that the research is useful and that it can be implemented or adjusted to be implemented in practice.
Have there been any sort of memorable moments for you in this work? Because it's been going on for quite some time now.
It has been going on for 4 years, as I mentioned, and when we started off the work, that was during COVID. Which was quite a tricky period because we could not meet physically. So I think it was only after the first 3/4 of the first year that we could actually meet the first time physically. And that was a very important moment, because you can do a lot of collaboration by meeting digitally, but it's also important to meet in person.
So that first day is one you
think so, yeah.
You will bring with you. And how would you say that, because as you said, you started out in COVID, has that sort of affected the research that's been going on, the fact that we were in serious times and it was like sort of a state of health emergency anyway?
I think so, and especially when it comes to the topics that were picked for further research. So one of the things that we discovered quite quickly was the tendency to work remotely. That we will also
we
hear.
will be talking more about that later on. Yes,
yeah. So in terms of topic, that has also influenced. And also during this period, we've become so much better in working together digitally. Yeah, we've learned how to do it.
Exactly. And that is one of the topics, as you say, we will be touching on later today. The report on these 4 years of work came out just yesterday and is available to people now. But I want to ask you, after today's conference, what do you hope will be the outcome of, we have several hundred people, I believe, following us this morning. What do you hope will be their outcome from today's conference?
I hope that we today will share some insights from these past 4 years about what we've learned. But as I said, I also think it's a stepping stone to the next period. And we will also have some prominent keynote speakers here who will give us some external perspectives on what's going on, which connects to the much of the insecurities that we see around the world today and how we can handle those. So I hope we will get some insights and some ideas for our next coming work.
For the continued work in these groups. You will be back at the end of this conference to then tell us if we got what you expected us to get. So we'll be meeting you at the close of this conference. But for now, we will be moving on to the first keynote speaker this morning. And we begin by taking a look at the current state of the world, so to speak, and of the Nordics in the world, to set the stage for the rest of this conference, you might say. And to give us all this background, we have invited Annika Webling-Korzinek, who is the head of the EU Commission and Representation in Sweden. The title of Annika's keynote is Waking Up to a New Age of Multiple Geopolitical Crises. She will speak first and take your questions afterwards. So just keep your questions coming in the chat box. We've made sure that there is generous time for Annika to reply. But first, I'll hand it over to you, Annika.
Thank you very much, Tine, and thank you, Nordic, for inviting me today. So I will, as Tine said, do more of a helicopter view of what's going on in the world and the EU's reactions to this. And in the past few years, I think we can say that we have seen a number of our European illusions, or illusion of ourselves, evaporate. We did not think that war could come back to Europe. We thought trade and economic growth would be much more important to Putin than to destroy Ukraine. We thought our energy systems were robust, and we thought we had invested enough in security, military, economic, cyber. And all of these, of course, as we have seen, have turned out to be illusions. The previous Finnish president, Niinistö, said, now it's about a year ago, but he said, Europe has to wake up. And I think we have, even though maybe we're still pressing that famous snooze button, hoping that 8 more minutes will give us just that time that will make the difference. Because we are still grappling a bit with the new geopolitical reality and what we're going to do with it. So what do we then mean with a new geopolitical order? We are in an increasingly multipolar global order with ever decreasing multilateralism. Lots of difficult words there. But it means that we have more players on the global arena wanting a prominent position, and rightly so. I mean, of course, why shouldn't they want that? But normally, when you increase the numbers of players in a game, you tighten the rules to make sure that the game actually works. But now we are doing a bit of the opposite. We have less rule-based global order, with less multilateral rules, with less value-based cooperation. And instead, we see increasingly transaction-based relations in everything from security alliances to trade partners, aid cooperation, and investment. So we see a shift from cooperation to competition. And its main consequence is the proliferation of conflicts and the normalization of the use of force as a means of pursuing our political objectives. Instability is now in a kind of an arch around Europe, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, of course, on top of the list, but it extends. We have unrest in Armenia and Azerbaijan, we have destabilization in Moldova and Georgia, and of course, we have the Middle East. And this arc of instability continues. It doesn't stop in the Middle East. We see it in the Red Sea, Sudan, Horn of Africa, Sahel, and beyond. And I think it's a fallacy to think that the conflicts in Ukraine or in Middle East or in Red Sea are regional ones. They have strong global dimensions. And it's a fallacy to think that these conflicts are not linked. Look at the narratives employed to fuel the conflicts and look at the opportunistic cooperation between Iran and Russia. And it's a fallacy to think that these conflicts can go on without the rest of the world being affected by them. Look at North Korean troops going to support Russia in Ukraine. We often say that free trade, open democratic values, and multilateral corporations are in the DNA of the European Union, which is also true. But unfortunately, the world is less and less democratic. According to a study at Göteborg University in 2023, 71% of the world's population lived in autocracies. And unfortunately, that does not mean that the other 29% live in democracies, because only 32 countries were considered liberal democracies, and most of those were still in Europe. On top of this, we have demography. By 2050, the world's population could reach 9.8 billion people. The population of sub-Saharan Africa is expecting to double, while Europe is shrinking. These shifts will most likely have direct consequences in terms of economics, security, migratory pressures, and they are very likely to affect Europe. And we have climate change. Climate change is emerging as a dividing geopolitical line. There are tensions between developed and developing countries, and here China labels itself as the latter, as you know. And the tensions arise on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, as well as on the notion of climate justice. The request for climate financing is a key issue for the Global South. And of course, it's a legitimate one, and we will have to deal with it, and we have to react to it. Finally, we have an uncertain future relationship with the US, increasingly so since yesterday, as you all know. The US-China rivalry sets the tone of the current world order, or disorder, if you so wish. It spans across all areas, from defense to AI, from shaping the world governance to winning the battle for the hearts and the minds. And EU in all this is kind of ending up a bit in a collateral damage in this toxic relationship if we don't fence in our own area. And all this sounds very much gloom and gloom. But in all this gloom and gloom, I would like to point out that there is also one illusion that others might have had about Europe that has also fallen in the past years. I am rather certain that Putin expected the EU to fold under the pressure, to lose unity and become weak. That illusion fell because EU has shown remarkable unity towards Russia. EU member states have so far unanimously agreed on 15 sanction package against Russia, provided more than 130 billion euro in economic support, and more than 50 billion in military support. 4 million refugees from Ukraine have been accommodated in the EU. But though that is positive, the unity among EU member states to stand up and to continue to stand up for Ukraine is not resting on stable ground, and it needs constantly to be fought for. So the EU's responses to this new geopolitical order are plentiful, and I will mention just a few. The most obvious and the most groundbreaking is the new strong focus on defense and security. For the new European Commission, which took office on the 1st of December last year, this is the highest of the EU's priorities. Joint procurement of military equipment, ramping up of the defense industry with the support from the EU's budget, discussions on taking loans to provide Ukraine with more military equipment. All of these were completely unheard and completely unthinkable just a few years ago, particularly in a country like Sweden, where we are right now. But they are happening. The European Commission will already in mid-March this year present a white paper on the future of European defence to outline the road ahead. Secondly, economic security. That's also a completely new EU approach. And it's focusing very much on breaking dependencies. We learned the hard way what it means to be dependent on fossil energy from Russia. EU has drastically reduced that dependency, but it has costed and it continues to cost. EU has much higher energy prices and costs than, for example, the US, and it shows in our competitiveness. And we know that we have similar dependencies. We have it on critical raw materials that we need for the green and the digital transition. China right now is supplying 93% of magnesium, 97% of lithium, and 98% of rare earth consumed in the EU. All of these are needed for the transitions. So we know that we need to source more domestically, and we need to work with new exporting partners, not to risk economic coercion and not risking ending up in this hostage situation that we did with energy in Russia. And new trade agreements, such as that with Mercosur, is one piece in that rather complicated puzzle. A new EU competitiveness compass, as it's called, will be laying out a roadmap for economic security, for competitiveness in the years ahead. And this is expected to be presented by the Commission already next week. For the first time in more than a decade, the EU is also taking enlargement seriously again. It sees a potential enlargement to Western Balkan, to Moldova, to Ukraine, as one of the strongest security policy tools that the European Union has. That said, enlargement will not be forced and it will still continue to be merit-based. With the composition of the new European Commission from 1st of December, as I said, it's also clear that crisis preparedness is a new and dominant focus of the EU. There was never before a European Commissioner in charge of preparedness, neither for defense, for that sake, which is also now in the cards. And we recently had the said former President Niinistö presenting a report on EU preparedness and on security that stressed the need for whole of EU, whole of government, whole of society approach to preparedness. For those who, like me, were born and raised in the Nordics some decades ago, this is not a new approach to preparedness, but it's a totally new approach at the EU level. Finally, to move a bit north, considering that we are at Nordregio conference, the EU perspective on Northern Europe, and particularly on the Arctic, has changed considerably with this new geopolitical situation that I just described. A direct effect that we can see is the opening of the EU delegation in Nuuk in Greenland from last March. And with Finland's and Sweden's accession to NATO, the Arctic borders to Russia have reached a completely new strategic priority, of course. NATO has identified the High North as an area of particular importance, and EU also has an Arctic strategy that highlights this area's importance, and not only from security perspective, but also due to the critical raw materials that I mentioned, and also the potentially new transport routes. So just to conclude, it is clear that the EU needs to properly wake up and to properly reorient itself in this new global order. EU itself has to take a greater responsibility for its own security, but also for its competitiveness. And the EU needs to engage not only with like-minded countries, but also with non-like-minded countries to help address these common global challenges, and hopefully also to promote a bit more of a positive reform agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Annika. And we just have time for a few questions. So to all of you watching, you are most welcome to use the chat to actually send your questions, and I will have them here on my laptop. But let me begin, because you talk about that Europe has to wake up. And obviously, being at Nordregio, everyone here is quite concerned about the role of the Nordics in this. And not all of the countries, as I don't even have to tell you, are in the EU. So how do you foresee that the collaboration between the Nordics and the EU can help?
I think, well, first of all, the fact that Sweden and Finland joined NATO, even though we have a problem, but plays an important role, because EU and NATO are working more and more closely when it comes to security. And of course, now having these borders and this cooperation within the EU as well, it plays an important role. And also the Nordic cooperation as such, it has a value also for the EU, because even though we have Norway and we have Iceland that are not members of the EU, they are used to being part of this cooperation, which is also a strong value also for the EU. So I think it does. They are maybe a bit members as proxies in a way, because they're also part of the economic area. So in many aspects they are the closest partners that the EU actually can have.
There are a few questions coming in for you. One is touches on the fact that you talked about how Europe unanimously has enforced sanctions on Russia, and that leads people to ask you, what about the role of Slovakia and Hungary in security? So the question, I guess, is more or less, how sure are you about this?
That's why I also said that this is something that we cannot take for granted, because we see, and we have had the whole time, we have had tensions. Saying that EU has managed to do this unanimously doesn't mean that it has been easy, because we have had countries, as you mentioned, Slovakia and Hungary, who have, to a certain extent, have different opinions. So far, we have managed, and we have got everybody on board, and that is, of course, the hope also for the future. But it is not to be taken for granted. I don't have an answer to how we're going to do it, because every time there is a new negotiation. But so far, we have managed, and we can only hope that we will continue. And of course, there are different means, and we can appeal, but also, of course, we can use economic measures, and we can use other political measures to try to make sure that we stay united.
And then, as you mentioned in your speech, there was a big event in Washington yesterday. There's a new US president as of yesterday, and everybody's sort of thinking about what will the implications be. And I can see there are quite questions coming in about how this will change the whole cooperation with the US. I also noted that some European leaders were actually present at this inauguration. So how big of a change do you think the EU faces in working with our biggest NATO ally, the US?
Well, it's too early to say, of course, but it is, I mean, one should not hide, it is a big worry for the EU and the EU leaders. It's a worry for Ukraine, for our continued support for Ukraine, which is existential for the EU. It's probably important for the US, but it's existential for the EU, that makes a big difference. But also when it comes to tariffs, because of course the EU economy is very much depending on the transatlantic cooperation, also when it comes to trade. So there are great worries. So there is the only hope, I suppose, I mean, maybe we'll hear more from the economists around the room, but is of course also that the domestic industry and companies in the US also realizes that tariffs will hurt them just as much as they will hurt the other partners. So it's not a great move from his side, from Trump's side. But so it's still up.
It is, and it also remains to be seen whether the tariffs will actually come and how strong they will be, obviously. Another question that I know has been discussed a lot in my country, which is Denmark, is the whole question about Greenland. And you mentioned also that about your representation in Nuuk. And there's a question coming in here about the European response to Trump's planned seizure of Greenland, so to speak. Now, it wasn't mentioned in his speech yesterday, and many Danes had a sigh of relief at hearing that it was not there. But this is a challenge, I guess.
No, of course. I mean, the EU's response has the whole time been Greenland is a part of Denmark. Non-stop. This is, so to speak, the response, and that of course it's never acceptable that anyone says, okay, we're going to take someone's land. I mean, that's not how it works. So, but of course, the dialogue will have to continue, but the EU's official answer to that is that it's not negotiable in that sense that Greenland is for sale. So let's hope that common sense prevails.
Yeah, we will have to see about that. There are big differences, obviously, between the US and Europe, but also in some fields between the rest of Europe, I would say, and the Nordics, the EU, and then the 5 Nordic countries. How do you think the Nordic approach, so to speak, the fact that the Nordics are joined together in research as the ones, as what we're representing today, but also in general collaboration, how can that affect policy in the EU? Does the EU even look to the Nordics?
Yes. Yeah. This year, 2025, it's 30 years since Sweden and Finland joined the EU. So we are kind of celebrating this because we can also see, and here I kind of put the Nordics into the same basket, because we can see that Sweden and Finland's accession to the EU in these 30 years have made an imprint on the EU when it comes to transparency, when it comes to equality, gender equality above all, when it comes to high environmental standards. And so I think this is, and when it comes to research, because the Nordic countries' research is often very closely linked also to applied research, so to companies and so on. So I think this has also made an imprint on the EU's big research program. And the other way around, I mean, the Nordic countries have also profited a lot from the EU's research programs, that not only for the money, because what we hear, for example, from the UK that sadly left, is that what they might regret the most, the research, is not the money, but the networks and the way of collaborating between. So I think there have been mutual gains from both the Nordics and from the EU in both directions in these past 30 years. And I hope many years to come, of course.
Let's hope many years to come. But Annika, thank you so much for giving us sort of the backdrop for everything we will be talking about, and for setting the stage, the geopolitical stage for us today. Thank you for being with us. We now move into the next session of this conference where we will be showcasing you how regional development research can contribute to better understand and dealing with, maybe even overcoming some of the crises that we're all facing. The very imminent and fast ones that we talked quite a bit about in Annika's speech, but also the slower yet very consequential crises, like for instance, depopulation, labor market shifts, that sort of thing. In this section, we will give you 3 short research talks on 3 different topics. You will have time to ask questions afterwards, so please keep them coming. I can see you have already familiarized yourself with the chat section of this Zoom meeting, so just keep them coming. And furthermore, all the 3 researchers will meet for a joint Q&A at the end of this part of the conference. Our first speaker in this session is Hilma Salonen, who is a senior research fellow at Nordregio. She's here to talk about her work with young Nordics on the move, attractiveness beyond the zero-sum game. So Hilma, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tina. And it's nice to be here with you this morning. So I'll be starting our research segment of today by talking about the crisis that people sometimes forget to count as one of the crises, since it's not something that moves so much as a bang, but more as a little bit of a whimper, as they say in the poem. And that is the crisis of the population decline, which affects the rural areas in all of the Nordic countries, also some cities, and then results in so the birth decline results in an overall population decline and a deepening urban-rural divide. So the angle that I want to talk about it today is this: how to talk about attractiveness in a way that would go a bit beyond this zero-sum game. And what I mean by zero-sum game is that often when we talk about the attractiveness, it kind of maybe easily leads to an idea that municipalities should compete against each other, try to get this diminishing amount of, for example, young families to not move to the neighboring municipality, but to their municipality. And then if the main focus is in this type of movement, it doesn't really address the main problem and in a sustainable way. So only providing short-term solutions. So how to talk about this problem from a new angle? There's, of course, many different angles, but the one that we decided to do was to start with a bit more positive spin. So where would people like to settle in by the time they are ready to settle in? For example, by the time they hit 40, what are they really searching for? If they're posed this question of, if you could live anywhere in the world, where would you like to move? What are the dream characteristics? So this is where this research started. And we conducted a survey in all Nordic countries. We had 1,000 respondents in each, 500 in Iceland. And then we are now processing and analyzing the results. And what we see is that we actually were maybe a little bit misguided, thinking that there is this dream scenario that people are actively thinking of. If only there would be a municipality that would have this and this and this, I would really wish to move there. Actually, by the time people are 40, maybe even before, 35, 30, they actually are already settled in. So more than half of Nordic people plan to remain where they are living now. And then what we also see is that people don't really do this rational sum of what are the amenities I need, what are the services I need, but they move for a more dynamic, nuanced set of reasons. And they are often very personal. So of course, practical reasons such as I need to find an education, I need to find work are of course always big movers. But then there's also something that is a bit more difficult to pinpoint. So people are searching for a certain type of a life. For example, some people wish to live in a more urban setting, somewhere where it's more diverse, somewhere where it's easier to find new friends. Whereas other people, especially when they are ready to build their own families, they wish to live closer to the nature, and they're looking for this type of an existence in a way. And then finally, a very important factor is the personal bond, that we ask how people feel about where they're living now and how much of a reason it is to stay somewhere or move into a place. And it is one of the biggest factors, biggest moving forces or biggest stable forces in people's lives. But of course, it's something that is very difficult to put into numbers. So now that we are working with this, how people move, what are their histories, what are their futures, we have started to build this Nordic matrix of movers. Here I only have Denmark and Sweden. The countries are not very much different for each other. So here as a sample, where we can only look at these two, and we see that, of course, we see that most people have left what they consider as their place of origin, but we also see that if we put it in these very simple terms, that there's the movers who have left their place of origin, the stayers who have stayed, the rooted people who don't have plans to move anymore in the near future, and then the more adventurous ones who have some plans. So we see that a lot of people, when they start living a more mobile life, they continue to live a mobile life. So then they are more ready to grasp into opportunities, keep on moving, maybe see if there's something else there, and they don't really feel this type of a connection, this personal bond anymore to the place where they are. And here I put Denmark as an example, as it is the most mobile of the Nordic countries. Whereas for Sweden, we see kind of like a flip side of this mobile lifestyle. So people who stay, then they kind of have made the decision to stay. So then they are less and less likely to continue moving, of course, the older that they get. And then again, this segment is the biggest in Sweden. But what does this is, of course, just a kind of a quick sample of this very myriad phenomenon of how people move, what are they searching for. But in the end, I want to talk about a little bit like, what does it tell to the regions and municipalities who would wish to still, of course, remain attractive? Maybe we see that there is not really this secret ingredient, this magical solution that people are searching for, but is there something still to be done? And what is interesting is that we see that most people don't really have this concrete dream where they would like to live, but of half of the people who are thinking of maybe moving in the future, 30% of them have the dream destination of returning back to the place of their origin. And this is mainly because of this very strong personal bond that they feel that it gives them something that they can't find anywhere else. So on that basis, I would make the argument that it makes sense to focus on people who still live in a place, even if they are less in number. So a nurture a love that is already there instead of chasing this fleeting attraction, so to speak. And then this is, of course, easy to say, and it's more difficult to then discover what nurture this bond with a place. Of course, it can be something like family reasons, historical reasons that you can't really affect, but we do also see something a little bit more concrete that I can offer as an advice. For example, modern housing is one of the concrete factors that people seem to be searching for, especially in Finland and Iceland. Then flexible education opportunities is an important factor in the sense that there is a lot of people who wish to move back, or maybe wouldn't have wished to move away from their place of origin, but they had to do so in search of education. So maybe some hybrid education opportunities can offer them a chance to stay. And then I also wanted to mention the nature reserves, as we see that the closeness to nature grows and becomes one of the most important indicators in what makes people appreciate the place where they're living now as they get older. And that is all I have for now.
Thank you so much, Hilma. Fascinating research and very interesting. We now have time for a few questions for Hilma, so please keep them coming in the chat section. Let me begin by asking you, we talked a bit about the slow crisis of the aging populations. Have you had a chance to look at how this will affect you? The fact that people are aging and there are not so many young people.
Yeah, it of course works when there is less people in the working age, but also when there are less children or in general less people who need a variety of services. So then it's more difficult to keep the service provision.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that is an extra challenge, so to speak, for some of these regions that are losing in populations. Are there any examples of interventions that actually work? If you were to be specific about, you talked about how some municipalities will be competing against each other to attract the right people, but what really works for mutual benefit?
Yeah, I think it is good to think about more in terms of well-being than in terms of growth. So how to grow in well-being, and then think of what makes, for example, a livable place. So for example, if a lot of people have moved out, it may make sense to make the center a little bit more concentrated in a way that it doesn't feel empty and you don't just see kind of like buildings that are not in good condition anymore. And that creates a sense of a more active municipality, and then maybe also a more active region that can support.
So to actually shrink your center, more or less.
Yeah, it's kind of the smart adaptation idea. So shrink, but think it can also be thought more as a transition that makes it feel more as an active process instead of just letting go and shrinking and giving up.
And have you seen examples of places that have actually successfully done that?
I think there are at the moment a lot of pilot projects, so active municipalities, active people working in municipalities, but it's a little bit of a problem that politically there is a lot of, it's a very difficult subject to address, so there's very few strategies to work with that.
Okay, there are quite a few questions coming in for you, and I'm just taking them from the top, and I haven't really thought the order through. Matilda wants to know if there's a difference between men and women in the matrix of movers.
Yeah, you can see some differences. In some countries, it's more drastic. I think it is Finland, my home country, where you see more that the women are kind of leaving the place of origin, which maybe a rural region, not necessarily, but often is. And then in some countries, it is not as drastic. I think in Sweden, it's a bit more, it's a little bit more balanced, but you kind of see the women as leaving and living more mobile lives.
And I think that's a general tendency, because I know in my country we have talked about that also. And I guess it's also to do with the fact that you see also a difference in the education system, that more women are actually going to university now than it used to be. So there is a difference there. Another question that's come in is from Badru, who asks, does it affect people to what extent they're heard or consulted by the authorities, for instance, in relation to policy making?
I wonder if it means the experience of the situation. But I think there has been some interesting pilot projects, for example, in Iceland, where there has been some money, but not a lot of money, but some money for the municipality to kind of like just build something together. And then they held this workshop together with all the residents to see what would be the key areas that they could build something together and address some things that they really need, for example, maybe some transport needs or,
Okay. You talked a bit about how some of the municipalities or the regions should focus on well-being and the actual make people want to live in the places of origin. But there are also obviously questions about growth and economic growth. And there's a question how you looked at job opportunities as a factor, because some regions might think we have to attract big companies and have more workplace. Have you looked at that as a factor?
We did ask if people would be happy to move to a rural region and for what reasons. So it seemed not just to have a job, but maybe if there is a job that has some added benefits, not just a better salary, but maybe something that they can offer, or if they can offer a job also for the spouse to move in. So I think it can act as a factor, but for some people they would leave anyway. I think for some people it's just important to live in a city where there is a lot of other people.
Okay. And then you talked about how, I think you mentioned that Denmark was the most mobile of the Nordic countries. And there's a question about what you think could be the reason behind this. Is that to do with size also, or what's your impression?
We are going to later analyze the distances, how people have moved, and then how that kind of correlates with their moving history. But I think with Denmark, it is just easier to move about when you compare it with, for example, with Norway. So it's kind of like a smaller decision to make in life.
So there is a difference there, because you might move away, but you're still closer to where you came from. And then one more question: is it so in Finland that people move after university or job, etc., back to their home region?
It is, it's a considerable share, not like most people, but a considerable share where you see, and I think it's especially with women are then the ones who return, and they often have kids, and they are often employed, so they kind of have the means to make this kind of a decision.
And so that is merely based on their relatives, or the fact that they want to move back to their family or where they came from?
Yeah, it's for social reasons. Then it is the personal bond is a big reason, and then of course something that they see it as more family friendly, close to nature. So.
And do you see there a possibility for regions or municipalities even to work strategically to attract people? I know, for instance, that there are sort of rural places in Denmark that say you may leave for studies, but we want to make sure that you feel the urge to come back.
Yeah, I am sure that it is already something that a lot of municipalities do consider, and maybe August, our next speaker, knows also more about remote work, that maybe that can act as a link between people who have moved but maybe would like to come back.
Okay, and then let's just end with a comment that came in from Ernst to everyone. He suggests that a job is nice and definitely important, but far more essential, I think, is what is there for you after work, socially, etc. Does that correspond with your results?
Yes, exactly.
It does. Thank you so much, Hilma, and you will be joining us again for the panel at the end of this research session. We move on now to the second research talk, and for this one, we're blessed we were supposed to be blessed with two speakers. One of them, unfortunately, is unable to make it today, but we're very happy that the other one takes over and covers both researchers. The presentation is called The Future of Remote Work, How the Pandemic Changed Us. So please welcome August Bogason, who is Senior Research Advisor here at Nordregio. The floor is yours, August.
Thank you, Tina. I'll try my best to cover my colleague's Lisa part as well. But I will therefore be discussing some of the key takeaways from a 3-year research project looking into the urban and regional development effects of remote work since the pandemic. And I think we jump straight into some figures. In the chart on your screen, you can see the percentage of employed persons who sometime or usually work from home. The colored bars show the different Nordic countries compared to the black bar, which represents the figure for the EU. And we see clearly that even before the pandemic, the Nordic countries generally had a high percentage of people who worked remotely, at least compared to the EU average. In the EU, 14% reported working remotely before the pandemic, compared to around 22% in 2023. Those numbers in the Nordic countries were around 27% of employed persons working remotely in the years prior to the pandemic, compared to 42% in 23. While the percentage of people working remotely has remained high since the pandemic, a higher percentage of people in 2023 indicate only sometimes working from home rather than usually working from home. So the COVID-19 crisis acted as a catalyst for remote work, with hybrid work as the new norm for those who are able to work remotely. And it's also very important in the context of speaking about remote work that most people employed in the Nordic countries never work remotely, and a lot of them don't have the option to do so, simply because how it works, how their jobs function, or so to speak. Since 2021, Nordregio has been exploring this remote work phenomenon in this project called Remote Work and Multi-Locality. We have considered policy frameworks that set the stage for remote work practices and explored the planning responses and spatial implications around remote work in the Nordic region. But we've also been studying these new ways of working as they unfold, and they are still unfolding, which presents a certain challenge, and of course more time is needed before we could better understand how remote work patterns might affect different cities and regions. Nonetheless, we have some takeaways that we can present for you, and when it comes to residential preference and mobility or mobility patterns, our research suggests that those who choose to move from urban cores often relocate to municipalities quite close or reasonably close in a commuting distance to larger urban centers, rather than relocating to regions or rural areas. New working patterns also bring into focus the importance of planning mixed-use neighborhoods that can accommodate both living and working. And in our studies on remote work in smaller towns and rural areas, we found that residential preferences are often closely linked to town attractiveness and relates quite a lot to what Hilma was speaking about earlier. Public transport operators continue to suffer from low ridership since the pandemic. During the pandemic, many urban areas experienced an increase in active modes of travel, and there is potential for remote work to continue to support these trends. Some studies also point to the potential for remote work to support reduced road congestion and decreased negative environmental effects of road transport. However, these results are dependent upon the built environments in which people live and work, and their accessibility to sustainable modes of transport for both work and leisure trips. The continuation of hybrid work has reframed how workplaces across space and time, for example, function in co-working spaces or third places like libraries or cafes. People use these places in higher numbers to do their work, but in general, our studies found that co-working spaces were more commonly discussed as a strategic response to remote work in the more rural areas rather than urban centers or small towns. New working patterns show the need for us to plan with adaptability in mind. For example, planning home and office spaces for greater multifunctionality. The COVID crisis has also invited us to rethink how space is conceptualized as such. The way individuals navigate their environments may not necessarily adhere to pre-existing divisions of urban versus rural, work versus leisure, or production versus consumption. And therefore planning and policymaking have to account for this, and new methods must require us to study mobility and urban-rural distinctions beyond our current categories. And one part of this project was actually developing a new urban-rural typology, which is a grid-based classification that helps us to better understand demographic trends. Despite the disruption and blurring of boundaries, some studies emphasize that there is no such thing as location independence. So all work, even the work which is done remotely, involves and requires something of a space in which it takes place. So we actually now have a window of opportunity ahead of us, or it's wide open, can we say. We have emerged from the pandemic with continued hybrid arrangements, and planners and policy makers have multiple pathways forward. They can sit back and see what happens. They can make planning choices that do not consider remote work. They can package remote work within other policies, or they can stay informed, identify potential risks and opportunities, and try to guide remote work to ensure remote working practices align with sustainable development goals. And to focus more on the regional and rural case studies we did as a part of this project, we take away from these last points: are we going to sit back and see how things develop, or are we going to use the opportunity to plan and try and implement policies that encourages remote work for the benefits of possible regional development? The regions and local authorities often feel that there's little they can do on planning and policy level to accommodate remote work to a greater extent than before the pandemic. But they do also realize and recognize that the pandemic showed that it is very possible to work remotely. And therefore, and very linked to what Hilma was saying earlier, the place where you decide to work and live, therefore is very related to general attractiveness. And a lot of municipalities and regions were actually focusing actively on their attractiveness before the pandemic, but then the pandemic came and showed us that it was very possible to work remotely without losing productivity and so on. So that has increased, and the possibilities for people to work remotely from a rural area therefore have also increased. But what is attractiveness as such? Mainly people answered that it was good access to public services, social relations, access to leisure and nature, the physical and natural environment, then trust, security, affordable housing, short distances, good overall services, a more relaxed life, a lot of people said. But even though I've said that there aren't many concrete things that regions or municipalities have done to accommodate remote work, there are some things that we can mention beyond focusing on the general attractiveness of the environment. These things were often related to actions to secure better digital infrastructure, transport improvements, and other public services, then being a direct or indirect participant in making co-working spaces an option, since that was considered more vital in the rural areas. And we saw that actually in some cases. But it's also important to acknowledge that at the more central governance level within the Nordic countries, there is strong support and political will for regional and rural development. Among the Nordic governments, there is a strong political commitment, at least on policy level, for increased regional and rural development. But this also demands action and support for the regions and rural regions in facilitating remote work, because these two things are deeply connected. So working spaces are one of those things that have been subsidized or even paid for by local authorities, or in some cases the state. And that's, for example, the case with Iceland, which even before the pandemic decided that all state jobs need to be advertised without a specific location, as long as it was possible. So maybe not if you're applying as a teacher or a nurse at some place, you of course have to be very place specific, but if it's more of a desk job, you could do it anywhere. But that also meant that people still wanted to come into a place of work, and therefore we see the map here with all the different co-working spaces which state employees can come in, so you can be working for an institution in the capital area in the southwest, but still be in the far west or east, and still have a place to come into work and socialize by the coffee machine, even though those are other state employees maybe working for a different institution or ministry or what have you. But to wrap it up at the end, the labor market seems to be stabilizing regarding remote, hybrid, or on-site working to some extent, but it's of course still developing. But we're at least showing that, or seeing that the preferred mode of working is a hybrid format. And while the public sector might not have to lead such a development, it can go ahead as a good example. I think it's clear that larger workspaces, traditional workplaces, and core industries will still be very important, especially in regional and rural context. However, remote work possibilities do create certain options. So with attractive living environments, with affordable housing and well-functioning infrastructure, good services, people can thrive and more easily bring work with them to the regions. And this can also have a snowball effect in the way that they create new opportunities for others in those regions, thus attracting more residents to or create options for those already living there. And most importantly, we have the possibility to work more remotely. The Nordics have the infrastructure and the tools, the labor market model, and generally there is high trust between employees and employers, between institutions, between the public and the private labor market, and so on. The high levels of social trust and how societies are built create stronger foundations for facilitating work remotely. So just to go back to the slides which we started off, showing the percentage of people working remotely before and after the pandemic, this clearly shows that the Nordics have the infrastructures and the tools, the labor market model, and the general high trust, which is the foundation for increased remote work, which can operate as a very useful regional or rural development tool. In the end, this was a large project with a lot of researchers involved. We already published 7 reports, so it's quite difficult to do them justice in such a short time.
But you did your very best, August.
I did.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And we now have time for a few questions for August. He will also be joining us for the panel at the end of this research talk session. But your questions for this specific presentations are more than welcome now. And I can see that they're coming in. Let me start with Lotta, who says, I'm not sure if I understand it correctly. I thought I heard that regions and local authorities find limitations to how they can provide for remote work and co-working spaces. What limitations have you found? And she thinks that one limitation is the ability to reimagine the future. We find barriers and limitations before we even get started on imagining what it might look like. An example could be the public libraries. What if?
Yeah, the limitations are which I refer to are mainly then in relation to what they actually physically can do. They very much know about the possibilities and want to utilize them, but they often feel that there are very few things that they can do and showcase. And one of those things is we took money and we rented this space for co-working. That's a physical thing you can show and do. So they find those things very limited, how they can affect increased remote work possibilities. But for example, in some cases, there were, for example, made more spaces in the public libraries and so on. So it mainly refers to physical things which they can, which you can touch and showcase. This is what we did, because it's hard to say. We focused on attractivity and increased services and tried to get that message out there to get people to see what a great place this is.
So the physical place that's more easy, so to speak.
Yeah, and there are limitations to what they can do in that sense.
Yeah, and you showed us the whole map of Iceland, where they had made actually co-working spaces all around the country. Are there any other examples of regions that have managed to sort of make a specific effort in this field?
I mean, there were some places in Denmark and Finland has been doing this for quite some time as well. But we also heard a lot of reports that the co-working spaces are then maybe not utilized as they see, or maybe mostly used by young people which are studying or startups and such. But
So to attract the whole labor force to these places is actually difficult.
That's quite difficult, and mainly it was used not as an important thing for people to actually work remotely, but more as a social thing, and give them an option to be around other people, because that's one of the main findings as well, which we are seeing more and more now, is that what people missed during the pandemic was the social interactions, and that's why they still work hybrid, like to come in every other week or a few days a week or so on and so on, if they have the possibility, mainly for social relations.
Yes, because that was a key takeaway, that people actually missed their colleagues during COVID. They wanted to see people. Many of them have returned to their workplace now to get that whole feeling. Is that, do you think, a durable tendency?
It's hard to say, but at least we see it's the main reason why people at least work in hybrid format and not completely remote, even though that it means that you have to commute, and so you decide that it's worth it, at least a few days a week or every other week or so on, just to have that interaction and
The water cooler talk.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The small coffee talks and so on.
Yeah. You talked about how obviously some jobs are not created for remote work. Obviously, if you're a nurse or a fireman or a teacher or something like that. But is it then a particular type of work? You talked about how young people and startups tended to be using these workspaces. Is a particular type of work a worker that opts for these options?
For the co-working spaces options,
yeah.
Example, if we go back to the Icelandic case, it's initially especially designed for state employees, whether you're working at an institution, a ministry, or so on and so on. So mainly people that work at a desk in front of a computer all day long. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, mainly public.
That was the initial thought, at least, but
Yeah.
it seems to be also working at the private market, and it seems also that the private market is much more open to hiring people at a distance, because they simply want the best person for the job, and they now also, to a larger degree, see that, and if that person wants to be located in Finland and work in Denmark, or live in the Faroe Islands and work in Sweden, that doesn't matter. And then there we go back to, I think, the high social trust that employers and employees trust each other, as long as you...
They trust that work is actually being done.
Yeah,
You're not only doing the laundry.
Exactly. If you deliver and you deliver quality work, it doesn't matter where you're located, as long as you do your work properly.
There's a question that's come in for you from Stefania. You talked about how this works at a state level, that the Icelandic state, for instance, had said that, you know, you can work from wherever in the country as long as you do your job. Do you see municipalities working on this, and are they open for these opportunities also?
They seem to be open for these opportunities, but in a more rural setting, they are also looking at it from the other side, because of course they want competent people to work for them, but they also see that we have very few jobs to offer, and maybe few specialized jobs, so we very much want to keep that locally, and then maybe not a person working for a small municipality in the countryside being and the employee getting that job maybe sitting in the capital area of that country or something like that. So it worked both ways, of course.
Yeah.
But they see the option, but they also see certain challenges with it.
One last question before we let you go for now. You will be back for the panel. There's a lot of talk, and we talked about the whole geopolitical situation at the beginning of this conference, and there's a lot of talk about hybrid attacks, cables being cut, vulnerabilities that have to do with what you just said, being in the Faroe Islands and working in Sweden. But, you know, if someone has cut the cable in the North Atlantic, maybe not so much. So this vulnerability, how do you see that affecting our willingness to accept remote work?
I think for now we don't have this in the back of our head. Maybe more and more, and we're realizing that different crises and different attacks can occur. So we're more thinking about these things. But as for now, I think it doesn't affect us that much.
So for now, we feel safe.
In that we can stay connected in some way, yes, I think so.
Okay, thank you so much, August. And as I mentioned, you will be back for the panel in just shortly after our next speak. Because we now move on to the last topic in this session. The title is Building Crisis Resilience, Insights from the Collaborative Regional Leadership Project. Here to give us this presentation is John Moody, who's a Senior Research Fellow here at Nordregio. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Tina, and good morning to everybody online. It's a pleasure to be here today to give you some information on this research we've been doing in relation to collaborative regional leadership in the Nordic region. So I think I'd start by saying that this morning you've heard a lot from my colleagues here about the various crises which the Nordic region is currently facing. And I think this particular presentation probably comes at the right time because at the end of this discussion, because what this presentation focuses on is the idea of collaborative regional leadership as an essential ingredient for helping overcome the types of crises which have been highlighted. So I want to get up front straight away that I think a key point to take from this presentation is that during crisis periods, there's a really, really strong need for regional and local actors to collaborate closely together to find crisis solutions, but also to help build overall regional resilience against these crises. So, over the past 4 years, my colleagues and I have been, we've been conducting research on collaborative regional leadership in the Nordics. So I hear you asking, what is collaborative regional leadership? It's a very good question. So essentially, collaborative regional leadership looks at the way in which regional and local authorities work together with other public and private actors. So these can be people from universities or industries or businesses, NGOs, civil society organizations. So it's looking at the way in which these people interact together to firstly drive policy change, secondly find solutions to socio-economic challenges, and thirdly to try and maximize any kind of newly emerging opportunities for the region. So this was a very practical research project in that what we wanted to try and do was we wanted to try and increase our understanding of how collaboration works in practice at the regional level between these different actors. So we set ourselves some very practical research questions, the first of which was, what are the main drivers of collaboration between actors? The second one was, what factors enable smooth collaboration between actors? Then we looked at what are the main challenges and obstacles to collaboration, and finally we assessed what are the benefits of working together at the regional level. So crisis and resilience weren't actually the main focus of this particular research project, but these two different themes did continually emerge throughout the research. So what I want to do for the remainder of the presentation is I want to present some of the key findings from the project, but I'm going to try and relate these key findings back to the key themes of the discussion this morning of crisis and resilience. Okay, so the first key finding from the project is that crisis can act as a key driver for collaboration at the regional level. So crises often create what we refer to in the political sciences as wicked problems. So these wicked problems, they're very much characterized by huge amounts of uncertainty and a complete lack of knowledge and a lack of policy solutions, actually. So these uncertain conditions, they create the need for collaboration. And this is particularly the case because policymakers at regional local levels, they need the knowledge and expertise of other actors. So firstly, they can enhance their own understanding of what's happening, but also to try and find effective solutions to the problems. So the second key point from the research to emerge is that crisis can create windows of opportunity for policy change. So this is the idea that in a crisis, a window of opportunity will emerge where regional and local policymakers can push a policy agenda forward in the direction of key policy priority areas in a region. So to do this, policymakers must be willing to collaborate and listen to policy ideas from a range of different actors. Because bottom line is, good policy ideas can come from the top down, but they can also come from the bottom up. So they can come from people with a mandate to make policies like public authorities at national, regional and local level, but they can also come from actors working in organizations, businesses, universities, societal groups, NGOs. So ideas can come from these actors. So what's really important is that regional and local authorities create frameworks where actors can come and contribute ideas, policy solutions. And what's also essential is that regional and local policymakers are willing to listen to a range of different actors, because you never know where that really good policy solution or crisis solution is going to come from. So the third key point from the research is that crisis can act as a catalyst for kind of governance change at the regional level, and collaborative governance change in particular. So I think we saw this pretty clearly during the COVID crisis, actually. So we will have examples from across the EU and the Nordics where the COVID crisis stimulated greater collaboration interdepartmentally within public authorities, but it also stimulated cooperation between regional level and municipal level authorities. And obviously this kind of collaboration was enhanced by the emergence in advancements in digital technologies, which helped to promote the interaction between these kind of different institutions. But what we also saw during COVID was that there was a development in brand new collaborative governance structures. So we have examples again from across the Nordics and the EU where, you know, new task forces were created, or emergency units were created to deal with the situation. So whatever you wanted to call these kind of new structures, they were essentially brought together to bring actors together to try and find solutions to the challenges presented by the pandemic. But I think one of the things we found in the research, though, is that a lot of collaborations are often kind of ad hoc and short term. So they're kind of created to deal with one particular issue, or often collaborations are funded through projects. So once funding kind of runs out or project ends, a lot of collaborations kind of dissolve. So this highlights the need within regions and local levels to try and establish some kind of permanent platforms which can promote a continuous dialogue between stakeholders. So the fourth key point to emerge from the research is that we want to highlight the importance of what we refer to as place leaders for facilitating regional collaboration. So in the research, we distinguish between both formal and informal place leaders. So the formal place leaders are the public authorities. They have the mandate to make policies and facilitate collaboration. But then the informal place leaders are all those other kind of groups that I've discussed previously, you know, universities, businesses, SMEs. So they don't necessarily have a formal mandate, but they're equally capable of starting, initiating and leading collaborative activities in the region. So what the research showed is that really good place leaders have a particular set of characteristics. They usually have very strong local networks. So they know key stakeholders and different sectoral groups, and they can get these actors together when needed. They're also usually very good managers. In particularly, they're usually good managers within a kind of multi-actor, multi-sector framework. They're also usually very kind of politically savvy people. They can spot an opportunity to build collaborations. They can be inspirational and persuasive to get people involved. But I think most importantly is they're very, very good at facilitating dialogue between people who usually have different priorities and interests. And they can facilitate dialogue in a way in which they can highlight the commonalities between these different groups and persuade them to go, find a consensus on the way forward. So place leaders are really important during normal time periods, but they're especially important during periods of crisis where you often need to bring people together very quickly and make fast decisions. So the best leaders are often not actually the people with the most knowledge and expertise, but the really good place leaders are the ones with the best management skills and the best facilitation skills. Okay, so I presented the few key findings from the project that relate to these issues of crisis and resilience, but I want to finish by providing some recommendations on how to build regional crisis resilience through collaboration. So the first recommendation that I'd like to make is that I think it's really important, if you can, to create sustainable long-term regional level collaboration structures or platforms. And I think there are good examples of these from across the Nordic regions where regional level forums exist which bring together stakeholders and local actors within a framework for continuous dialogue, so they can continually discuss newly emerging challenges and newly emerging opportunities as they arise. So I think having some sort of permanent forum of this nature is an important thing. especially in a crisis where you need to respond immediately and quickly, and you've already got kind of a body of key stakeholders already together, so it can kind of facilitate that during a crisis situation. But at the same time, it's also important that these permanent structures have kind of an inbuilt flexibility and adaptability to be able to react to crises of different natures. You know, crises often emerge spontaneously. They have different aspects, different dimensions. So if you do have a permanent structure, it's really important that there's adaptability and flexibility to ensure that you've got the right stakeholders involved and you're open to new ideas and new discussion topics. And I think one way to build adaptability and flexibility into collaborative structures is to try and work thematically. So that means that if you build collaborative discussions around key themes or challenges. And I think one thing that emerged from the research is that smooth collaboration generally occurs when everybody in a partnership knows their roles and responsibilities. And I think it's often might be a little bit easier to kind of build this kind of clarity around roles and responsibilities if you work in a kind of thematic way, if that's possible. So the final recommendation that I'd like to make is that I think it's really important that public authorities really need to think strategically during a crisis. And I think this goes back to a point I made at the start of the presentation, where I talked about crisis being a window of opportunity for change. Because I think what you often find is that regional and local level authorities, they're often the junior partner in multi-level governance policy making, which is often dominated by the national governments. And I think we certainly saw this during the COVID crisis, where regional and local authorities, particularly in cross-border regions, had little say in the direction of policies. And a lot of these policies actually had a negative impact of citizens living in those areas. So I think there is a need during the crisis to recognise the important role of the subnational level in both informing policy development, but also they've got a central role in policy implementation as well. So I think during a crisis, public authorities can strategically use crisis periods to build their own power base. So if you can use collaborations, if you can form collaborations around key strategic areas of regional kind of importance, you can create a critical mass of stakeholder support, which has the potential to influence national level policymakers. So what I mean by that is it's not just the regional authority going to the national level saying we think this is what we need to do. You're going to be going saying, well, it's not just us who think that, it's the industries, the businesses, the universities. Maybe you could potentially engage citizens in some way as well. So that's it from me. I've just got one final thing to say, is that if you'd like to learn more about collaborative regional leadership, you can find the final project report at the QR code in this presentation, but also on the Nordregio website. And I think an interesting part of the final report is that we've developed a model of collaborative regional leadership. And this model is designed to support public authorities to try and embed collaborative thinking within their regional policy-making structures. So it's a very practical model, and I hope it will be useful for practitioners and other stakeholders in the region. So please go and have a read and see if it can help. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you. As we did with the other researchers, we now have time for a few questions for you before we invite the two other speakers on. I want to, you talk a lot about how the collaborative leadership in action can actually work. Could you mention some of the best examples you've seen? Do you have any specific examples where you thought, oh, they really knew how to do it? They really got it.
Yeah. No, it's a good question, because I think it's good to say that, look, collaborative regional leadership, it's a very academic concept, right? It's very broad.
It sounds very abstract also, to some people.
Well, it is. It's in a way, it's very simple. And I think it's good to state that, look, collaboration is commonplace. It's happening all the time. Public authorities are always interacting with people in stakeholders at the local level. So this isn't something that's new as such. But I can highlight two quite good examples, I think. One of which emerges from the project, and this is actually a really good example of bottom-up collaborative leadership. This was driven by one citizen. So there was a visionary midwife in Iceland who recognised that there was a problem in rural areas of getting healthcare provision to pregnant women living in remote areas. So what she did was she got together with the municipalities and digital companies specialising in telemedicine and said, look, we need to introduce kind of online healthcare telemedicine approaches. But there was a problem because the national level were kind of a little bit resistant to using this kind of technology. So they kind of built this collaboration to kind of lobby national governments to loosen the laws around telemedicine. So it's really quite effective. In fact, I would say the BBC should probably do an episode of Call the Midwife. It was that good.
And call this particular midwife.
Exactly.
Yes.
There was absolutely. And then I think another good example, and for me this is like a gold standard, because we talked about the need to create sustainable long-term platforms, and I think a really good example of that is the Karlstad Smart Specialisation Academy. So this is more of a top-down example where the regional authorities responding to the need of the EU to get EU cohesion funding, you had to develop a regional smart specialisation strategy. But this has all the hallmarks of good regional leadership, because they had a particularly effective place leader, a man called Anders Olsen. And he had very good networks. So he initiated the idea and he brought these people together. And the idea is that you bring the key stakeholder groups together and you try and identify what are the priorities in the region, and you put that in within a strategy. And it was really his kind of facilitation skills, his drive, his commitment into getting these actors together, which makes it a really good example of long-term sustainable collaboration, because that platform's been going on for 5-6 years now. So it
can be sustainable and durable.
It can be.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
There's a question that's come in from you for you from the audience. I haven't read it all the way through, so you're just going to have to bear with me. Question comes from Manvidas, who asks, how does Sweden and Finland joining NATO change our understanding of crisis management? Could we claim that membership brought security guarantees, but also expanded the scope of responsibilities as well? And does it correspond with civil society's mindset in the respective countries? That's a big one.
That is a big question. Actually, maybe we should take that in the panel debate.
Maybe we should. Actually, we'll keep it for the panel debate. Maybe we should.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, because you talked about how in situations of crisis, there's also the opportunity for political change. I guess that's what one British former Prime Minister would say is never waste a good crisis, to actually make the change you want to make. But how do you maintain this? I know that you're insisting now that it can actually be permanent, but when the sense of urgency is gone, how do you make sure that people actually still want to work together?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I think that really came out of the research, actually, is this idea that once the problem's solved, the collaborations just disappear, or alternatively, if a project ends or funding runs out, collaborations dissolve. So I think firstly, I think you've got to, this is where you've got to have some kind of evaluative assessment. You've got to say, look, we've had this team together, even if it's responding to a particular problem. But, is this, can we keep this team together? Can we upscale it? Does it relate to other policy problems? But most importantly is, I think people who work in collaborative partnerships, they need to see the benefits.
Yeah.
Of collaboration. So if you can continually highlight the benefits of participation to them is as an organisation or an individual, then they're more likely to say, well, we'll keep this going. And I think that's particularly the case in relation to the two examples I just provided in Iceland and in this Karlstad Smart Specialisation Academy. Is that in the first instance, the telemedicine was upscaled to the national level in terms of a response to healthcare problems, but also other regions as well thought this is a good idea. So I think you've really got to highlight what are the benefits of collaboration, and then you've also got to try and find some ways of keeping it going financially as well.
Obviously, that's it goes without saying almost, and then I suppose also, spreading the word. I imagine there will be quite some inspiration, for instance, from the midwife situation in Iceland that could be used elsewhere. Yeah. So in your opinion, do the countries and regions, are they good enough at sharing the insights that they're making when they then actually come together?
I don't know, because I don't think people are thinking about collaboration in a kind of structured way. Mm-hmm. And I think if you're gonna highlight and increase visibility in relation to what works and what doesn't work, then you've got to be approaching collaboration at a regional level and you've got to be evaluating it, and you've got to be saying what works and what doesn't. And I think one of the things that did come out of the project is that a lot of projects are getting better using communication tools and communication structures to highlight increased visibility. And I think a lot of the regional level things are now being kind of upscaled. But of course that brings its own challenges, of course, because if you upscale something from the region and it gets kind of taken up by the national level, then the national level, you kind of lose that kind of regional focus. And that's what's really important here, is that you're making policies which are place-based, and they respond to citizens' needs, they address local challenges. So if you are going to upscale a good collaborative model, you've got to think carefully, actually, and you don't want to lose that kind of regional essence.
Yes, and the motivation also for coming together in this local place.
Yeah.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for talking to us, John. We will now be changing the scene a bit to bring in the two other research talkers. So bear with us for just a short minute while we get the stage ready for you. Well, hello again. We have now sort of changed the scene and we have brought back the other two research speakers. So we now have Hilma Salonen and August Bogerson with us, also with John Moody. We're ready to take your joint questions for the panel. Just keep them coming in this in the chat box that you've used already a few times. I want to begin with a question from me, actually, and it goes out to the three of you, maybe not starting with John, who just needs a bit of a rest after speaking to me for so long, but for Hilma and August, and then finally John. The whole regional development research that you are all conducting, how do you see that contributing to the actual crisis preparedness that we've talked quite a bit about since we set the stage with all the crises that are going on globally? Can I begin with you, Hilma? Do you see your research actually helping on being more crisis prepared throughout the Nordics?
Yes, certainly. I would say that the main thing is that often at the national level, people are working a little bit in silos, which is a problem that people working usually notice, but it's something that is kind of difficult to overcome. So then when you go to the regional level and the municipal level, it can be something like an overworked municipal employer, but they are actually juggling very big transitions and very big questions at the same time. And then when you talk with them and you find their solutions, you can kind of see how to bridge the silos and look at things more holistically when it comes to crises.
August, do you want to expand on that?
One thing I usually take away after speaking to people in the regions and the more remote areas is perhaps that, and in some ways relating to what Hilma is saying, because they are juggling many balls, have many responsibilities and are not maybe working on a fixed thing, but have to like wear many hats, that can often serve as a problem, but it's also often very helpful. And also because if you're working in a specific department, you usually know people working in all the other different departments, and maybe if you're at the municipal level, at the regional level. So the distances are not just short for you to go to work or go to the store. There are also very short distances in getting answers and getting things done, because it's usually just a phone call away. You don't have to speak to a person that then speaks to a person that speaks to a person and then gets back to you. If you're lucky, you can just call the person, or maybe if you go out for lunch, you even meet them at the local restaurant. So those distances are often very helpful. So that also breaks down the silos, this closeness, and people are in many ways more willing to cooperate and work on different things together. So that's one thing I usually take away from doing this work.
And John, I guess that also quite correlates with the research you've been doing.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Tina. I think in terms of how does research contribute to this kind of crisis preparedness, I think it does so in like three main ways, really. I think, firstly, I think we do a lot of work in regional development in terms of identifying new demographic trends and new socioeconomic and environmental trends. And I think that's going to be really important to see how different regions in different trends within regions can potentially be impacted by crises. So it's trying to evaluate, are certain regions more vulnerable to a crisis? Are certain regional or certain citizens within a region or certain social groups going to be are crisis going to have more impact on them? And I think research can contribute to that. I think the second thing is related to what I've been looking at is governance. Okay, so we do a lot of research in relation to governance structures in terms of which actors are important, which stakeholders are heavily involved at regional level. And I think having a mapping of that is really important during crises as well. So you know which actors are going to be key players, how to get them together, how to collaborate. And then I think finally I was noting down that maybe this issue of power asymmetries as well. I think a lot of crises, which Annika was talking about earlier, are going to be kind of taken at the national level. Things are food shortages, energy issues, all of these kind of big, all-consuming crises. These are going to be dictated by the national level. So what's going to be really important is for research to look at the relationship between the national level and the regional level and try and find synergies between what regional level policymakers identify as problems in their regions and how they're going to correspond with the national level. But I just want to say, more generally though, I think this notion of preparedness is quite interesting, because I feel like it's kind of completely contradicts human nature in a way. And because I think if you look at the COVID crisis, one thing that told us was that maybe we're not prepared in the sense that I think a lot of national governments had plans and strategies in place, but they were never implemented. So in a way, like human beings are often reactive. So the point is, if you are going to talk about preparedness and develop preparedness strategies and crisis strategies, then you've got to implement them. And I know that's sometimes difficult because it's you don't have the finances available at that moment, so you need to deal with issues which are right there and not think about the future so much. But still, if you've gone through the time and the effort to produce a preparedness strategy, you should try and implement the findings so you're ready for when that moment does happen.
Thank you so much. There are questions coming in for you. There's one here, and I think it's mostly directed to you, August. I'll just go ahead and ask it. It's from Stefania. She asks, has it been researched in Iceland how many people work remotely for the government and what the distance is between their residence and the institution? So are they actually based in Reykjavik and then work in the far northeast, for instance? Do you have any percentage figures, for example, regarding office jobs?
Not on the top of my mind, but they no.
You are forgiven.
Yeah, no, but they have actually published quite a report quite recently about this phenomenon in Iceland, and more research is underway, which we are not directly involved with, but I've been asked to help out with a few things, so we'll be indirectly involved. But percentages, no, I don't have them on the top of my mind.
You don't have.
But the initial thought behind this is, of course, it's implemented before COVID, and it is, of course, to create a more even field for people outside of the capital area to apply for state jobs, because and at least one percentage that I remember is that around 70 there are more state jobs, way more state jobs placed in the capital area than people living there as a proportion of the country. So people want to try and even that out and go a different way, because it has proved, as Denmark tried maybe a decade ago or so, in simply moving the institutions into different municipalities outside the capital, that provided problematic there, and people simply quit and found a new job. And that also happened in some cases where it was tried in Iceland. So this was a new way of trying to move the jobs from the capital area without disrupting their operations as such. But there are reports out there. I don't have the numbers.
There are reports out there. They are to be found. Yeah. We won't be questioning you about accurate and more underway. Okay. So another question that's come in from Badu, and I guess it's for all of you, as I can just read it here. In a context with wicked problems that we talked about in the first presentations, where knowledge is scarce, such as in a crisis, to what extent can and should leadership consult or hear citizens in relation to the relevant actions or activities that are taking place? I don't know who of you would like maybe to give comments on this question. Yeah, go ahead, John.
Start. Yeah, I think citizen engagement is really important, and it's one of my passions. Actually, I'm trying to look at ways to engage citizens in regional policy making as much as possible. But the problem is, of course, crisis situations require speed. Citizen engagement is slow and quite time consuming and in a difficult process. So I think the best you can kind of hope for is that the representatives in regional authorities and in local authorities, that they have a really good understanding of the local context. They understand what citizens' requirements are and what their needs are. But what I would say is that crises create very difficult situations. I mean, policy making in general, right? You can come up with a policy idea which you think is going to be great, but it might not work. Okay. So it's dangerous in a crisis situation that you're going to rush to a quick decision. But I think that's where it's really important that I think you've got to kind of make incremental policies. You've got to kind of respond incrementally to look, what is this little problem? Come up with a policy to try and solve it. It might not work. It might work. Some of it might work. Some of it might not work. And I think that's kind of the problem with policy making in general. That can be in normal time periods as well. But yes. In general, yes, citizen engagement, really important, but it's going to be very, very difficult when you need to make speedy decisions.
And do we know, Hilma, if this is also important for people when they decide where to live, if they're close to the actual decisions that are being made? Yes, you have to share a microphone, and I can see that you're doing your best, so thank you. But is that important to people when they decide where to live?
Yeah, I believe that the idea that you feel that you can be an active part of the place where you are living, and that it's, for example, it seems that the places where people like to live, they see as more socially diverse, which maybe can give an inclination of that they can see that there's more space for them, space for different type of people. And then, of course, that they look for places where it's easy to make new friends in, which can be the place where you're from, and then you would like to stay there, or then a place where you're moving. So I think it's kind of like this sense of activity that definitely plays a part.
Another question, because we've talked a lot now about crisis, and obviously we're all, when the COVID was coming, we were all threw ourselves at the COVID crisis. Now we're talking about what will the implications of the new American presidency be. So there are some crises that we see as very urgent, but are there types of crises that are under prioritized? Is there something that we're missing when we look at this very current affairs situation about crisis? Can I begin with you, Hilma?
Yeah, I think definitely crises that extend beyond the election cycle. So you don't see the results after you have to be, or before you have to be re-elected. So it's things that are easily left in the margins, like the marginalization of young men, for example, where you should make very long-term investments. You can't just pour money in one thing and then see results. So it's often these, I guess, in a way, wicked problems that are left in the margins.
And that's also what you talked about in your presentation, about how it's mainly actually women moving away from the rural areas, that this whole shift. Why, in your opinion, do we not focus on that? Is that because it's not in this election cycle?
Yeah, I think there is something, and it is, of course, also this difficult mix that it's also, if people have different wants and different needs, for example, someone doesn't see themselves in a small community, they wish for a bigger community, it's a very personal decision, so you can't really change it as a policy decision that you should become a rural person. But then, I think there is also something that long-term investments in civil society and maybe some community building is something a little bit unsexy that is difficult to get money for.
Yeah. August, is that in your experience also that there are crises that are being under prioritized because maybe they're not as sexy, as Hilma said, as the political big US presidency related crisis?
Yeah, of course, it's difficult for elected officials and so on to say we are preparing for this and this costs so much and so much resources and money, and people don't really see it, and we can relate that, for example, to climate adaptation, which can be very place specific. I mean, in the far north, in Scandinavia or in Iceland, it might be mudslides and avalanches, and in a more southern region like southern Sweden or specifically Denmark, rising sea levels and so on and so on. And it's of course very, we say, unattractive as such to pour and pour lots and lots of public funds into these things that don't affect people directly, but then when the crisis come, it's very easy to say, look, we did that, we prepared for that. When the mudslide came, we had certain preparations, so it went away from where the population is living instead of directly into the town with catastrophe consequences and so on. So of course it's difficult to prepare for things that might happen in the future, might not. But then of course it's also very, very simple when the crisis comes on, when the catastrophe happens, to then blame the people that were in power. Why didn't you prepare for this? So it's quite difficult.
It's a bit of damned if you do and damned if you don't.
Precisely.
Yeah. John?
Yeah. I think I would say that maybe the word crisis might be a little bit overused these days. Actually, everything seems to be a crisis. But I mean, if we're going to use this word and we're going to use it generally, I think there are different types of crises, right? There's the spontaneous one, which comes out of nowhere. There's the anticipated crises like COVID. Everyone saw it coming, but still probably not very well prepared. But then I think there's also the slow burners, which Hilma saw. So if any are going to be under prioritized, and I wouldn't use that word either, I would say it's going to be these slow burners. And, I think there are issues which have been going on for a long time, which are crises in such that people out migration from rural areas. This has been going on for a long time. Also, how do you rebuild kind of old industrial regions where things have, industries have moved out and haven't been replaced, and people haven't come up with solutions to these big problems actually. And then as a result, sometimes people are just living with it now, and it's more about kind of adapting, or it's not about mitigating. It's about adapting to what is, and I think those kind of crises kind of sometimes go by the wayside while the sexy things get prioritized.
Exactly, and that leads us beautifully to the last question from the audience in this session, which comes from Margarita, who wants to know if you could share some details on what regional characteristics or practices can actually foster collaboration. You all talk about regional collaboration in the dealing with the challenges. And are they transferable, or are they very specific to the regions? Can I begin with you here, Hilma?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, there is, as John mentioned, there is a lot of characteristics, but one thing that comes to mind is that there is a lot of value in something that may seem a little bit ad hoc, something like active people just knowing a lot of other active people, having their own networks and having ideas. And then I think there is not enough emphasis on kind of like identifying these people and thinking how to kind of bring them in closer into kind of like a more dynamic, maybe structuralized ways of collaboration.
Do you want to expand on that, August? Do you see any regional characteristics or practices that can actually foster collaboration?
I could get back to, and it relates to what Hilma says, the short distances between people in these smaller regions. People know each other. Everything is usually a phone call away. But then when and that relates to what John was saying earlier, when crises happen, the state usually takes over. And they make the decisions, and they don't take into account maybe what the local authorities are thinking, even though they have specific knowledge on certain issues. And we can relate to COVID, for example, when the certain states decide, okay, we're just going to close the border. That's what we have to do. But then in some cases, the border actually goes through specific towns in the Nordics, for example, on the Swedish-Finnish border, and people there say, okay, now I can order a pizza, but I can't go and get it, or the guy delivering the pizza can't cross a certain line. I have to go to work. I have to take my kid to kindergarten, and so on and so on. And then there's an imaginary line. So that relates to what John was saying earlier also about having specific plans, but also then when crises hit, implementing them and having a look at them. And for example, in that case, it would be okay to close a border, but then a certain plan would say, okay, but these and these rules apply for these border regions because otherwise those societies are non-functioning de facto. So that's something that could be learned about how these short distances in the smaller communities function, if we could somehow get a similar function from the local authorities up to the state level when crises like this happen. And for that we need policies and plans, as John mentioned, and we need to take a look at them when the crisis actually happen.
Yes, and I guess, John, just to sum it up, that you may have regional or local solutions that can be, that can be taken over more or less by the national level. But from what I hear from all of you is that flexibility is also a key word here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think obviously, we've done a lot of research now on collaboration in collaborative regional leadership. And what I'd say to Margarita is that, I mean, in the report, there are a lot of good examples of kind of collaborative structures which can be used. But I'd come back to this point I made in the presentation about working thematically. So if I was at a regional level authority, I'd want some kind of a thematic group or task force focusing on this issue of preparedness, where you're going to sit down, get key actors together and say, right, what are the key issues, what are the key crises which could be potentially we're going to face in our region, and sit down with those people, try and work them out, and then develop a strategy to develop that. But I have to say, I'm actually more optimistic about kind of building crisis resilience and in crisis preparedness at the regional level than I am actually when we're talking about kind of cross Nordic collaboration. I mean, you look what happened during the COVID pandemic, where borders shut down, and that really impacted people in the regional areas. And we have cross-border committees and all of these kind of organisations, but during a crisis, national level often just shrivel up. We're going to look after ourselves here. They don't think in a cross-border sense. So I'm a little bit more pessimistic about kind of Nordic collaboration when it comes to preparedness. But then again, that's something you need to sit down in a room, try and find where the connections are and how you can collaborate, I think.
So lots of work still to be done for the people in charge, I must say, yes.
Oh, for sure, yeah. We want to get our pizzas.
Okay, thank you so much to the three of you for sharing your views on this. Thank you for talking to us. And good luck, I might add, on what's waiting ahead. It's now time to move on to today's final keynote speaker. He comes from the Department of Economic History at the University of Gothenburg, where he's a lecturer. We've invited him here to give a speech on the curious history of eco-financial leadership. And I know for a fact that in this session, and you might be a bit surprised, you will be hearing quite a lot about milk in this keynote speech. Your questions are obviously more than welcome. We have time for several of them, but first I will hand it over to you, Oskar Broberg. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me to be able to give this talk to you today. My name is Oskar Broberg. I'm from the Department of Economy and Society. My subject is economic history, and I was very glad to be able to give this opportunity to speak and to be able to use my historical research and also be challenged a little bit to try to put it in the perspective of the theme for the conference today. And I was thinking about starting out listening to the introduction that Annika gave about the geopolitical situation of today that we're all very familiar with. Following up with John talking about the type of wicked problems that we are facing in all aspects of the political life today. And the word crisis have been used quite a lot during the past few hours. And of course, in the theme of today of future-proofing the Nordic, that means, okay, but to what extent this is actually useful to relate to history in this aspect. And coming from me, I've been doing, most of my research has been on business and financial history, not so much maybe interested in the companies as such, but rather how we can use the study of companies to actually understand something about the time that we're living in or that we lived in. to also get some perspective of the problems that we see at the time and ahead. And I will take my point of departure really from two concepts here, and the one is critical junctions, which can be thought of sort of an interpretations of the things that we talked about during this morning in terms of crisis, that, okay, but how can we relate to what we perceive as critical junctions in history to think about the future? And the other part has to do with actors. What kind of actors do we think about when we are trying to analyze different kinds of problems? So keep these two in mind, critical junction and actors, and I will get back to them. And the case study that I will a little bit use now to talk about these issues are actually a study about the emergence of organic milk in Sweden. So it might be a little bit far-fetched from the themes that we talked about so far, but I hope that in the end we will try to see how they come together in one way or the other. And to get a little preview of that, just to also explain the picture you see in front of you here, an important part of what I'm thinking here is really to see how the responsibility of eco-financial leadership boils down to we have to take maybe into account the aspects of doing business, to see the role of also commercial actors in these societal changes. But how do we also relate that to change in terms of practicing ethics? Because when we are talking about political change in different ways or planning, that of course also entails how we are thinking about the values in ourselves, but also in the society as a whole. And how do we infuse the political process to this? Which of course also then borders to the aspects of how do we produce knowledge in certain times to be able to both do business and to practice ethics. And when we are thinking about this, in my research on this, an important part was that in the 1990s, there was beginning a fairly strong idea of the role of companies in pursuing positive change in societies. And a good example of this is from the Harvard Business Reviews, is they can be seen as a little bit of in the forefront of thinking about the role of business in society. And in 1997, Stuart Hart was writing a report called Beyond Greening, Strategies for a Sustainable World, in which he says corporation can and should lead the way. Okay, so that was really saying something about the time that we were living in the 1990s, that in Harvard, this could be a point of departure. And that pinpoints one type of actor, but going into the research project that I was doing, trying to understand the emergence of organic milk from this perspective, I started, as we historians quite often do, to just put together the statistics. Okay, so the easy part was to see, okay, how much organic milk was sold in Sweden, was produced and sold in Sweden from the 1990 to 2005. And here we can see that in 94, we see a shift in the line and a start of an expansion, which continued throughout the 90s and the beginning of 2000. And this could be one way of starting to say, okay, maybe here we have some sort of critical junction that we can analyze and think more about. And the easy interpretation of this is that, okay, well, it actually happened something in 93, 94, because the largest dairy in Sweden, Arla, was making a change and being more in the role of what Stuart Hart was talking about, shouldering responsibility. They were changing their production. They were making new contracts to farmers to produce and deliver milk that could be sold as organic milk. So the easiest interpretation is to say, well, it seems like Stuart Hart was right. It was when Arla decided to do this, then something happened. So we have a critical junction in 94. My argument would be, following my research project here, that this is a much too simplistic answer. And it doesn't really help us to understand the big questions that we could to be interested in and to be able to tackle the type of wicked problems that we want to really come to. So what I would say is that what we see here in 94 is an example of a measurable proxy of something that is more a rather larger historical transformation. And if we are interested in the driving forces and to see how did this change actually come about, then we have to step back and give us slightly longer history. So diving into the many phases of 20th century agricultural modernization, I give you this collage of pictures that to me gives some of the important threads, root threads to this change in 94 that we want to understand at a deeper level. And of course, in the upper hand corner, you see the tractors that were starting, and now I give you sort of the Swedish version, but of course it's quite similar in many European countries. It's also similar in many countries outside Europe, but with different timings. But staying to the example of Sweden, we have a rapid mechanization and chemicalization of the Swedish farmers in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And this we can see also if you look at the numbers at the center of the page here. You can see that from 1950s to 1990s, what we see here is that the number of farmers in Sweden are decreasing by 90%. We can see that the cows decreased by 2/3. We can see that the number of dairies decreased by 95%, while the production is roughly the same. It goes down a little bit, but not too much. Of course, what that means is that we have a very rapid productivity race in Swedish agriculture. And on the face of it, that was a very positive development. And if you take the actors in the lower left-hand course, that's the Social Democratic Party, which was at the power most of this time. You have the Farmers Association, and you also have the Agricultural University. They were very strong alliances between them in pushing these different aspects of this change during this time. However, we also have countervailing forces at this time. We have, of course, the start of the environmental movement. We have the Silent Spring of Rachel Carson in the 1960s. As part of a larger, you have the hippie bus there, the alternative movement in the 1960s and 70s, pushing not only for environmental issues, but of course also for gender issues and peace issues and what have you. So we have, on the one hand, a very strong economic material change going in high productivity, but also very distinct environmental effects of this, leading to crisis awareness to some extent. But also, we have the development in the 1980s with environmental movements more moving into traditional forms. So we have the rise of Greenpeace and these type of environmental organizations, but of course also moving into international organizations like Gro Harlem Brundtland's UN report on our common future. And this together laid the foundation for the development. So this is the very long, of course, very brief history I give you now, but the forces that were coming to us when we were approaching the start of the diagram that I just showed. And what I think that this is why this is important is to see that in order to understand these critical junctions or crises, if we use that language, then I think it's important to not to be afraid of the long history and start to disentangle, okay, these were seemingly very different forces, but how can we understand how they were also coming to what we see in the lower right-hand corner? On the one hand, you have the commercial in the 2000 of when Arla had transformed and was actually using organic milk as part of the general advertising. But of course, also the continuous change in the agriculture sectors with the discussion of GMO and so forth. So taking this and going one step further to the development of organic milk, What I did was that I was looking both on statistics, I was also going into the archives of some organizations and also making interviews with some of the leading proponents in within the field. And then I would say that one root thread, which is important, which you see on the left-hand side, that's the Demeter. That's one of the first sort of organic labeling in Sweden. It's from the anthroposophic movement. It was strong in Järna outside Stockholm, still there, but of course it also had the international roots going back to the early 20th century in continental Europe. The important part here is that the work that was going on within this alternative movement and more specifically in Demeter was considered by the majority society in Sweden as very marginal and not at all. It was more seen like, okay, that's something that they can do, but it has nothing to do with us. And that also goes with almost all of the traditional actors within the agriculture sector. But what happens in the late 70s and early 1980s is that different of these alternative agricultural organizations were starting to talk to each other. And in 1985, as you've seen, three prominent representatives from some of these different organizations were meeting and were setting up, and this is from the founding meeting of KRAV, the first labeling organization which was aiming for a wider audience, was formed. And the point here is that this was formed, but by these alternative ideas of how you would want agriculture to change. But they were also very early on in inviting traditional actors to come on board. So they had the cooperative movement, KF, coming in early, but also ICA. So they needed the distribution net to be able to actually make an impact on the market. And then in this first years, the large dairy of Arla was very, and I would say in 1985 it had nothing to do with milk, because then it was vegetables and cereals that was at the table. But a few years later there was an initiative in Värmland of how can we do this, also take rules to make a label also for organic milk. And then what happened was that the big dairy of Arla was very hesitant and quite negative to this, and it took a few years into the 1990s before that they saw that this actually had a commercial potential that they could be used. So my overall argument here in this history would rather to be that it's more fruitful to think of it that the 20 years prior to this, what we could call a critical junction, is actually the most important and most interesting part in trying to understand the forces behind change. And this we can think of as alternative visioning. While the actual change on the market, but also on the very concrete, if you measure the levels of pesticides or fertilizer used, is actually happening from the 1990s onwards, when commercial actors are moving in and taking on this challenge. But what we also see then is a conflict coming up between these forces that think about it as an alternative way, in a much more broader way, that the world should be in a different way, and this sort of co-optation of this new way of doing things in terms of more branding, and which can be sort of organic branding. And here we can see, you see the cans on the right-hand side. That is actually also coming from the anthroposophic movement, because they are the production from Järna, but updated in a more branded version in the 2000s. So for those interested in more of the details of this story, you will also be able to have the links afterwards to the articles that have been written about this. But I will try to sum this up. But I should also say that in the lower hand corner, you can also see that this organic branding discussion of these issues was also coming back when the Dagens Industri, the leading business paper of Sweden, make a special issue about the green transformation in 2006. And what did they choose to put on their cover? Well, it was one of the farmers of organic milk. And now Arla had realized that this had a big branding power, so they were happy to put a young woman who was taking over from a generational dairy farm, and she was sort of labeled Arla Elin to also be able to be sort of the poster girl for this new way of thinking about organic milk. And so, summing up this, if we take this in one sense fairly narrow case study of organic milk, what does it has to say more generally about eco-financial leadership? Well, to me, and again, it was interesting to come back to this research now in the context of what we talked about today, because I think that the multiplicity of actors with partially different aims and interests is very important to note, that it's easy when you think about critical junctures to narrow down not only the time frame of what we are thinking about and trying to understand, but also very much what actors are involved. Because the more narrow the time frame and the stronger story you want to tell, it's easy to also boil down it to a single organization or even a single person who sort of were doing the change. But I would say that it's the cooperative tradition that we can see here in this case, and which I would argue is actually on a larger scale, could be applicable. And we have a strong cooperative tradition in Sweden, but I would also say that we also have it in the Nordic countries. And we can see that very much in the relationship, for example, to KF, the cooperative movement, during the whole 20th century. But we can also see it that traditional commercial actors like ICA was very early in doing this cooperative work that was needed to actually take this alternative vision, building up the structure and actually making it more of a business-oriented type of capital that made it possible to also get leverage on the change. So I would say that this multiplicity of actors and cooperative tradition could actually be a strength rather than a weakness to manage critical junction. And I think that's important to underscore today, when the European situation and also the Nordic situation can quite often be emphasized as being a weakness, that we're not very strong and so. And just very, very briefly to end there, I would say that the reason why I suddenly, from this organic milk, have a picture of Televerket and Ericsson is to show that I have my specific case study here on milk, but that we can actually point to several other industries and processes during the 20th century where we have seen this multiplicity of actors and the cooperative between commercial interest and public interest, and the development of information communication technology is one of these examples. So I think that you can take this and actually put this in the mindset of Mariana Mazzucato, who is on the last picture there, to think more and deeply about the need for developing new types of cooperation between different actors. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Oscar. I'll now join you. I just need to get my microphone here and my laptop in case questions come in for you. You are most welcome to send your questions to Oscar. Let me begin, because by talking about this cooperative tradition that you have in Sweden, but we have all over the Nordics, it sounds almost like a law of nature that change on the big agendas must come from the Nordics. Or?
Well, I mean, you can see, of course, you can see a lot of change coming from other parts of the world, but driven from very different, with different agendas, but also in different ways. So, I mean, one of the examples that I do in one of the articles that I wrote was the comparison between the US case and the Swedish case. And in the US case, it was very clear that there was a clear conflict, much more conflict than cooperation. between organic interests and more traditional agriculture. And in some respects, of course, conflict can also mean competition. So I would not say that, I think we should be careful to maybe paint a too rosy story that, well, if we all just do it together and cooperate, then everything will be fine. But I think maybe that if you really want to think about how can we change the society we're in, I think you have to think deep about, okay, what are the traits that we have here? And I think one of the strengths that we have here, relative to other places, is the ability to cooperate.
Yeah.
And we heard that earlier today also about the importance of trust. And of course, cooperation and trust goes close together.
So does that mean then that, in your opinion, on this level, that the Nordics are better at leading change?
Well, I would say, if you look at what was the next step in the story that we see here? Well, Arla, the Swedish Arla and the Danish, they merged, and they, in just a few years, they actually became the largest producer of organic milk. So, when we maybe today hear about the fantastic stories about American companies taking over the world, I think we can see that, well, we have actually quite a lot of examples of where we have Nordic countries and companies from the Nordic countries who have been able to develop from this more cooperative tradition and also be rather successful on the global market. So again, I think we should think more about what this cooperation, what it could mean.
Yes, but I'm sure I'm not the only one who's heard about the Draghi report and how Europe in general is lagging behind. And there seems to be this, we always sort of, tell ourselves that we're very good at cooperating, we're very good at our cooperative nature, history makes it all easier. But Europe is, as you also mentioned, in some fields, falling drastically behind. So how can we use this story that you told us about organic milk to actually become more competitive?
Well, I think we have to think about at least along the two lines when we think about competitive, because when we talk about competitive, it's easy to think about some of the biggest companies and to what extent they are leading the market. That's one aspect of competitiveness. The other aspect goes to, I think, which is maybe closer to what we're talking about here today, the society as a whole, because a lot of this sort of competitiveness of China or the United States has been very much driven by the unequal outcome of it. So this is sort of the competitiveness of China, for example, has been enjoyed by the rich people in China who can reap the benefits, or the consumers in other parts of the world who can reap the benefits of their ability to sell cheap, but which we can actually. So we have to be a little bit careful when we talk about what competitiveness is and what it really means for the economy, for the specific companies or actors, but also for people in general. And I think one thing which is a little bit missing in the discussion today, when we talk about competitiveness, is that Europe has been actually, there in historical discussion, it's been talked about the demise of the Nordic welfare model for 40 years. And still, we're still in the top league of welfare globally.
So I take it that you, as a teacher of economic history, you're actually quite optimistic, where we see many people telling a story about decline in Europe. You're not so sure about that.
Well, of course, I'm as worried as everybody else about the big challenge that we are ahead. But I don't think that we should be careful. We should sort of nurture the crises and critical junction as a way of thinking about these can be thought of as awakenings to think about what we need to do. But history gives us plenty of examples that things can be done. And in the long, we have to be, even in times of crises, we have to think about how we can work long time. Because I think one of the biggest dangers of crises or critical junctions is that our view is becoming much too narrow. And we know from history quite certain that the good things tend to be built over long times, while it's the negative things that usually hit us in the face.
So optimism and patience.
If I can supply that, I'll be happy to do that.
Okay, Oscar, thank you so much for speaking to us today. It was a pleasure having you with us.
Thank you.
And we're now ready for the final reflections on this conference. We're almost coming to an end, so just bear with us while we set the stage. Because we now have Anna back with us. Thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you.
We are coming almost to the end of this conference, and I just wanted to maybe give some final reflections and sort of wrap up everything we've heard today. Because you set the stage for us this morning by saying what was to expect. Was it everything you dreamt of?
I think it was pretty much what I dreamt for, and a bit more, I should say. I think we've heard a lot of interesting presentations about current research, but also looking out to the outer world and to see what's happening around us, and that will also feed into the work that we have ahead of us, indeed.
And let's just attach a few words to the three sections we've had here. We started out with Annika's sort of stage setter, which was quite serious and difficult. What was your key takeaway from that?
I agree with you, and I think what I took with me was this wake-up call that it really is of a new geopolitical order, the world order that we're seeing, and how that impacts on different fields. And when she talked about how the issues of security has now risen to the highest priority of the European Union agenda, whereas in history it's been not a priority from the European Union. So I think that was one thing that I picked up on. But also towards the end, she talked about that Sweden and Finland are now celebrating 30 years in the European Union, and that the Nordic countries create value for the European Union, but we can also benefit from the European Union. So I think that is a very positive message, and it intrigues me. How can we develop that further? How can we explore that further? I'm quite convinced now, having worked with Nordic issues for quite a few years, I'm quite convinced that we have a lot to contribute from the Nordic region. So let's find the ways to do that into the European work.
And that was indeed what the research talks were all about, wasn't it? Those were examples of what can be learned in the Nordics. So what would you want people to get from the research talks that we gave them today?
Yes, and I think also the research talks picked up also on demography, for instance, that was also raised by Annika. And something to bring with us there is the main aim in regional policy and in rural development in the Nordic countries is a balanced development and to make all parts of the Nordic region to thrive. Mm-hmm. And as we heard now that rural areas are facing challenges when it comes to population decline, for instance. So that is definitely something to continue to work on to keep this Nordic idea of inclusion and of balance. But we also heard a lot about attractiveness and how to enhance attractiveness, not only in rural areas, but also from employer side when it comes to remote work. Mm-hmm. How can we make use of these possibilities of now working hybrid, which is a great benefit both for employers and for workers, and to get all the family business running to have this possibility to work hybrid. So I think working with issues on attractiveness will be more important when it comes to planning, and also to continue to build on the Nordic trust. That is also a piece of the puzzle when it comes to remote work, the trust among people. It's a piece of the puzzle when it comes to remote work, and certainly when it comes to what John talked about collaboration and collaborative leadership.
Yes, and I guess really that the sense of trust also was key to some of the examples we heard about. Actually, very regional, very local collaboration in dealing with the crisis.
Yeah.
So coming towards the end, we also had this historic presentation of the organic milk will never be the same to me after this presentation. I must say. What was your key takeaway from that?
I think my key takeaway was this idea how do we make change happen, and that it is critical junctures, but to understand what's happening, we need to take on a longer historical perspective, and we need to identify what were those critical junctions along the road and who are the actors involved. And that also brings us back to this, as Oscar mentioned in the end, the cooperative tradition that we can build on in the Nordics. But that is also linked to what John talked about the collaboration and building governance institutions that can provide a solid framework that can be used in times of non-crisis, but also in times of crisis, that we are well prepared. And in order to be so, we need to have those collaborations and the place leaders who can work both cross-sectoral and multi-level to understand what's really going on. So I think from these research examples, I think we've picked up on a few things that we can bring on in our future work.
And talking about the future work, it's been a 4-year period now in the thematic program, the TGC. What's next for the TGC?
So for the TGC, the program period is now closing down, but there will be a new regional cooperation program. So we're just starting up now for the next period from 2025 to 2030. And the topics that we'll start working on, they are named resilience, attractiveness, competitiveness will be raised again, inclusive green transition is a topic coming up, and land use and prioritization and planning. It's a lot of conflicts of interests when it comes to the green transition and also other areas, and that will also be raised here. Indeed,
and also touching upon some very current discussions that are going on in all the countries. Plus, they are interlinked, so to speak, aren't they?
Indeed.
Yeah. Well, good luck with all that work. I must say, are there any final remarks you want to give the audience today?
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you. I would like to thank you, all the speakers that have contributed with their insights and the research results and provoking discussions, sharing some ideas, and thanks to the audience for all the good comments that we have received along the way. And thank you to you, Tine, for leading us through this webinar. Most valuable, and look forward to talk to you again.
Absolutely, and that brings us all the way to the end of this conference. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for sticking with us all the way. I just want to remind you that this report came out about the TGC, came out yesterday, I believe. So that is now available. And if you subscribe to Nordregio's newsletter, you will hear all about upcoming reports that you might find useful. So that's it for now. Thank you for joining us, and have a nice day.